Oh, you guys wait this morning, making you wait more now. Alright, how's everyone doing today?
Good.
Doing good, I'm a little sleepy. I had my cousin's wedding, so we were out late, and then, I'm really tired. But I'm here, I'm good, I'm alive, I'm well.
Amen.
That's what matters. So, and we had extra hours, so that helped. So, alright, before we get in, as always, do you guys mind praying with me? Father God, I just thank you so much for who you are. Thank you so much that you love us so much, you created us, God, that you are a God who wants to have a relationship with us. You don't lead by fear, but you lead by love. You ask us to make the choice to follow you, you don't demand it. And God, we're just so grateful that you are a loving God. You are such an amazing God. We ask that we remember that, God, always and forever. God, we ask that this message will remind us of who you are, but more importantly right now, the message will propel us to act on that. It's not just something we know, that we take action. So God, I just ask that you work in our hearts, including my own, work in our hearts and minds, God. Pierce our hearts and minds with your word. We just pray against any distractions, things that might be going on in people's lives, anything like that, where the enemy is trying to distract their focus to not hear what you have to say. Just pray that everyone's able to be attentive, and their hearts and minds are ready to hear what you have to say. We say this in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. Today we're going to be talking about reconciliation. Simply, that's easy definition is just the restoration of friendly relations. You know, having good relations with people, and what that looks like. And so I want to start off with a story. So I was a customer at I am a customer, I should say, at a bigger body shop, like a chain. That's the word I'm looking for. And so I had this issue one time. I've always been a really good customer there. Always been kind of, I work in customer service, so I try to keep myself very, good. But every once in a while, things get the best of me. I'm human, and I'm not gonna lie. So, I just got done spending like $600 on my brakes. I find out that I need, on tires, and I find out I need new brakes. I need some new, I forgot some sort of tie bar, no, not tie bar, but anyways, some sort of thing underneath the car, I forgot what it's called. I'm blanking out right now. But anyways, something for my car. Anyways, so I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so expensive. So of course I'm like stressing out financially, because like, where's this money going to come from last minute? You're finding out about this stuff, and I'm, of course that stress is getting to me. And unfortunately that leaked into my conversation with this gentleman, because I'm talking to him about, I have this warranty on my brakes, because I got my brakes there, they offer free lifetime brakes, And so obviously it doesn't include the labor, just the pads, but I'm like, okay, awesome. Like I don't have to worry about that part of it. I only have to worry about the labor, And of course I have this coupon, so I'm like, hey, I want to use this coupon. They're like, well, you can't use the coupon with your warranty. And I'm like, but the coupon is actually cheaper than my warranty. So the whole thing was kind of upsetting me, because I'm like, well, why am I spending, what's the point of this lifetime brake, guarantee, lifetime brake pads, if when I can come in with a coupon, it's actually cheaper? Shouldn't I be able to compound that on top of it? Shouldn't the coupons be good, Of course, not the case. So I'm frustrated, so of course I end the conversation. I'm like, thanks for nothing, and I hang up. And of course it's not the best way to handle that situation. I think most of it was like, Vinny! And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm just frustrated. It's funny, but it's not at the same time, But, so I end up, I'm getting frustrated, and I'm really upset, and so then I'm like, well, maybe if I call corporate, maybe they'll somehow honor both, So I call them, like, hey, anything you guys can do, I don't really think it's fair that I purchased my brakes, so you guys offer me this deal about free brake pads for life, yet I have a coupon and you're saying I can only use either. What's the benefit then of the free brakes? It kind of seems misleading. They wouldn't do anything, so of course I was frustrated, and I was like, whatever. Ended that conversation. Fast forward, and I go into the shop. I had to go in for, I think, my tire rotation, because that's where my tire's done. So fast forward there, I get there, and I see the gentleman that I was on the phone with, and he was definitely not a happy person. And I don't blame him. So let me put it that way. I don't blame him. Like, I'm not, I would be frustrated too, because I work in customer service, so I get it. So I'm sitting there, and I'm going up, and of course he's just very stern, very firm. He's doing his job. He's not, but he's not giving me friendly service, and I'm frustrated. And I realized in that moment, like, I could have actually berated and done like, hey, like, you're supposed to, I'm the customer, treat me right. I could have done something like that. I'm not saying that's right. I could have done that though, right? I think a lot of us, sometimes people would do something like that. Or I could have called corporate and said, left a horrible review for him. I could have actually, done something to get, because I was frustrated, angry, like, how dare you treat me like that? But I really felt like in that moment, God was asking me to apologize for our last encounter. And so I end up, we're cashing out, and he's like, anything else I can help you with? And so I'm like, yeah, I just really wanted to say, like, I'm sorry for last time, like, I was, I hope that's not like me. I've been here for years. I've never been that person. Like, I'm really sorry. Like, I like, genuinely, like, I didn't mean, whatever. I was just frustrated, and I apologize. And actually, he had no idea what I was talking about. He didn't even remember that part of it. He was actually more upset because, unfortunately, when I made the corporate call, it fell on him, and he took that personally, and I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I was like, I never complained about you to corporate because that wasn't my concern. My concern was that the fact you guys wouldn't accept a coupon, which is a corporate issue, not a personal issue. And so we had to have this conversation, right? Because we're talking through these things because he's frustrated because, like, well, this reflected bad on me, and I'm like, well, I didn't mean for it to, like, that wasn't even, I didn't call complaining about your store, I just called and said, hey, I'm frustrated, like, I want this coupon to be accepted. That's a corporate thing, it's out of your control, and I get that, so I don't, you know what I mean? And once we had this conversation, this dialogue, it was, 15, 20 minutes, I don't know however long it was, but, we ended that conversation, like, understanding that we had a misunderstanding, and understanding, like, he was taking something personal that wasn't meant to be against him, and I was just explaining to him I didn't mean to do that. So when we went through all this, it really kind of cleared the air, and so it left on a really good note because he was just like, okay, we shook hands, we had this conversation, and from there, I'm leaving, and I really just felt like God was asking me to do something a little bit more. That day that I was there, they were really hectic, they were busy, I could tell. And I was like, you know what? So I went to Tim Hortons, like, I got, like, the Pick 10 and some dozen donuts and brought it in. And, like, the face that he had when I had done that, right? The face that he had was just like, wow. Like when does a customer ever, like, kind of apologize and then back that up, And so when I did that, he was just like, dude, you didn't have to. Like, he was just so excited. And for me, that was where reconciliation started to officially take place. Because now when I go there, we have this reconciled relationship, right? Because I could have, some people might just leave it, well, who cares about them? Some people may go further and say, how dare they treat me like this? They shouldn't. But instead, I was like, you know what? And maybe because I work in customer service, so I get it. I have that conversation. Now, I don't say this, please, no, I don't say any of this to be like, wow, look at how great Vinny is, he's so awesome. Because I have many failings. Clearly, like I just told you, I told the guy things for nothing. So, remember that. Remember that I'm not saying that this is an example about how great I am. The point is, this is why this means a lot to me right now. Because in this moment, I really felt like God was calling me to reconcile this relationship. And so, hence the reason why I'm talking about reconciliation. I'm not perfect at it by any means. This is one story. So, just making that clear. So, simply put, right, we must be people of reconciliation. Hebrews 12:14 says, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. Right? We are to do everything in our power to live in peace with everyone. Right? When we think about this idea of living in peace with people, that's being reconciled with them. Right? You can't live in peace with someone if you're not reconciled. That relationship isn't restored. And even more importantly, right, if we want to draw unbelievers right? We want to draw unbelievers to Christ. We need to live lives that reflect Him, right? I thought it was awesome. The last two songs were all about how we need to, how we're supposed to be representations of Christ in this world, and that's important, right? We need to proclaim the good news, but we need to do it as we're actually living out that Christ-like life. And I think reconciliation is a big part of that because that's the gospel. And so Ephesians 4, 1 through 3 says, "As a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you to live a life worthy of your calling you have received. Be completely humble, gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." Again, it's through reconciliation that we remain united with our brothers and sisters in Christ. And then we see that this includes things such as being humble, gentle, patient, full of love. Like this is the heart behind reconciliation, right? We need to have these things, patience and love, and we need to understand people. We need to have the willingness to hear what they have to say. So reconciliation is important for both us with the unbelievers and us within the church. We need to continue to do that, to keep the unity in the church, right? Because that's what shows people. Like when people look at the love within the church, they see something different. They're attracted to that. Matthew 5:9 says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be children of God." A peacemaker is someone who pursues peace, which again is reconciliation. When you're pursuing this idea of peace, you're pursuing reconciliation. And we have to realize that a peacemaker is a child of God because they, like God the Father, are reconcilers, right? God reconciled the whole world to Himself. So we should pursue reconciliation in all of our relationships. That's why people who are reconcilers are called children of God, because we're like the Father. When you think about that, right, in any situation, you have a kid, and you're like, "Oh, that's my son." When they kind of do saying, "Oh, this is my, little me," whatever. It's kind of the same concept, right? Like it's this idea that as we reflect what God has done, for people, we are His children. I mean, we're always His children. You get that, right? But the heart of this verse is the point that He's reconciled the world to Himself. So we, as His children, should be reconciling our relationships with people, and obviously to Him as well. 1 Peter 3, 8 through 13a says, "Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good." Ready? "They must seek peace and pursue it." They must seek peace and pursue it. "For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." Simple enough, right? That we are called to be people who seek and pursue peace. We need to seek and pursue reconciliation in our relationships, in our world. That is what we're called to do. Just simply reminding us with these verses that we should be peacemakers. We should be people of reconciliation. And I want to talk about forgiveness, right? It's a step towards reconciliation. Colossians 3:13 says, "Bear with one another and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you." Ephesians 4:31 to 32 says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, and along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ forgave you." Right? These verses are a reminder that we are called to forgive just as Christ forgave us. Right? And for me, when I think about reconciliation, forgiveness has to be a part of that. There's no way you can have reconciliation if you don't actually have that forgiveness. How can you truly reconcile a relationship without the forgiveness in your heart? So forgiveness is a vital step that paves the way to reconciliation. And we're called to do it just as Christ has done for us. I think another thing we need to do is we need to recognize our own sin, not to condemn ourselves, right? Not to condemn ourselves, but to remind us of what we've been forgiven of. Because that will propel us to a life that is full of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Right? If we remember what we're forgiven of, right, we will then therefore want to share that grace with the world. We will then want to therefore be that much more willing and able to forgive others because we realize what we've done. We realize that we're not perfect, right? We have to remember these things, that we're not perfect. So Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." 1 John 1:8 says, "If we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us." Right? That's a reminder. We're all sinners. Right? So again, this is a reminder that no one is perfect. Right? It's a reality that should humble us. And right, with that humility, forgiveness and reconciliation become possible. Because if we're humble and we have humility, we can then recognize, right? We can then recognize ourselves. We can then recognize how we're not perfect. We can then recognize what our sin is. And through that, we can better posture our heart to have forgiveness towards those that wronged us. But we can also, as well, ask for forgiveness for those that we wronged, right? Because if we don't recognize our sin, how can we ask for forgiveness? And that's part of reconciliation, right? Reconciliation is two-sided in that aspect, right? There's times where we need to ask for the forgiveness, and there's times where we need to forgive, and there's actually times where we need to do both. Probably many times. I don't think there's really any time where we probably don't ever need to ask forgiveness. I mean, there might be those situations, but most of the time, right, if we're being honest, it's a two-sided thing. We need to both ask for forgiveness and we need to both forgive for people. So humbling ourselves and realizing and recognizing that we are sinners is a huge part, I believe, in that because it humbles us and reminds us. And I think we need a reminder of what reconciled us back to God, right? We talked about this idea of being children of God and how He reconciled the world. Romans 5:8 and then 10 through 12 says, "But God showed His love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Goes on, "For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to Him through the death of His Son, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to Him through the death of His Son. How much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through His life? Not only is this so, but we also boast in God, our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned." One, again, that's a reminder that, again, we've all sinned. But the main reason I bring up these verses is to remind us that the cross, right? The cross is how we've been reconciled to God. Colossians 1:19 to 22 reinforces this. It says, "For God was pleased to have all His fullness dwell in Him, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things." Through Him to reconcile Himself. And keep doing this. And through Him to reconcile to Himself all things. Okay? Whether things on earth or in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross. Right? Through Him to reconcile to Himself all things by making peace through His blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior, but now He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death. He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death. And obviously this is the death on the cross. It's Jesus we're talking about. To present you holy in His sight, without blemish and free of accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you've heard, and that has been proclaimed to every other creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, have become a servant. So again, we will remember, right, when we talk about this idea of being children of God and we're peacemakers, right? It says that God did the ultimate reconciliation, and that was through death on a cross. The cross is how we were reconciled to God. And it's a vital reminder of what our Father did for us, so that we will be driven to do the same with people in our lives. We're to be messengers of this idea of reconciliation, right? There's two parts. I'm using the same word, but there's two things reconciliation means here. There's this idea of reconciliation that I'm talking about when I'm saying we need to be people of reconciliation. That is the idea of being peacemakers and being people who restore relationships. And then there's being the messenger of reconciliation, which we'll see in just a moment. I'll read it and I'll explain what that's referring to. All that, 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 19. All this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us to himself and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, Christ was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting us to the message of reconciliation. I believe when he's talking about the message of reconciliation, right, entrusting it, he's talking about what he was just referring to. Christ reconciled, right, the world to himself, right, through the cross. And we are messengers of that. So we're supposed to be messengers of this ultimate reconciliation, the gospel. Right? We are messengers of that. So despite God did nothing wrong, right, we see that we know God did nothing wrong, right? It was us who turned from him. He initiated reconciliation with us. How much more so, especially when we're wrong in our situations, should we initiate reconciliation with others in our lives? Right? God, who did nothing wrong, reconciled himself to us on the cross. How much more so as individuals should we, especially when we're wrong? I'm not saying only when we're wrong, I'm saying especially, right? It's a big difference. Especially when we're wrong, how much more so should we be reconciling ourselves with people in our lives? And again, we always want to obviously remain reconciled with God. We want to continue to have that reconciliation with him, when we've sinned, right? We're not just sinning against people, we're sinning against our God in heaven. So we want to obviously ask him for forgiveness and heart posture that as well. So if we're going to carry this message of reconciliation, shouldn't we be people who actually display reconciliation? So if we're going to be people who are going to carry messengers of the gospel, we need to be people who walk out this idea of being people of peace, right? So how can we sit here and be messengers of the gospel, proclaim the gospel, and then look nothing like what we say we believe? Because if we genuinely believed it, and we genuinely believed everything we were forgiven of, which is why it's important to remember our sin, right? We would, therefore, be more willing, more able to forgive others, and people would see that. But if your life looks nothing like that, you're not willing to reconcile relationships with people, you're not willing to do those things, how real is the gospel in your heart? How real do we really recognize what we've been forgiven of? I think it's so important that we remember that, because people are watching. And if we're going to proclaim the gospel, we need to walk lives that look like Christ. If we're going to proclaim this ultimate reconciliation, I think the least we can do is reconcile our relationships with people here who've done far less worse to us than we've ever done to Jesus. I think we have a good story in Luke 7:36-47 that kind of wraps this up. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet... when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is. That is, she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had money to pay back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house, you did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. This woman recognized her sin, right? That is why she was weeping when she came to Jesus. Because she recognized her sin. She recognized what she would be forgiven of. And we see that if she didn't recognize her sin, nor realize that she needed Jesus to be reconciled to God, she'd have no reason to come to Jesus. So while we all do sin differently, right? We all have our different sins. We all have different, people, maybe levels, if people want to put it that way, however people want to, what we determine is different, higher, lower, So while we all do have these different levels of sin, right? I believe here Jesus is referring to this recognition of sin. Because we know when he talks to the Pharisees throughout Scripture, he calls them out time and time again for their hearts and for who they are. So I don't think here he's saying to him, hey, you're perfect, so you really aren't forgiven that much, you're not going to love that much. Here's what you've done since I've gotten here. You know what I mean? Because I think throughout Scripture, when we look at it, we see that Jesus is constantly telling the Pharisees, you need to live this way. You keep living this way, but your heart is wicked. Your heart, So we have to understand the context, right? That the Pharisees weren't the example. So I believe here, when I'm reading this, that Jesus is referring to the recognition of the sin. When someone realizes how much they've sinned, when someone truly understands that, they'll come before Jesus weeping at his feet. And when someone has been understanding of what they've been forgiven of, they will love that much more. Which means they will be able to forgive that much more. Which means they'll be able to reconcile their relationships that much more. I think it's really important to understand. Now, granted, he could be talking about literal, sin versus sin. I don't think the Scripture, based on what I read, I don't think it necessarily supports that directly. But I would say that, again, what I'm understanding here is that the recognition of sin. Because we know the Pharisees, right, they weren't perfect. And they had sometimes the most wicked of hearts. So, that would be my understanding here. So, with all of this, what are we to take away from this, right? There's a lot of different things. We talked about the gospel. We talked about reconciliation. We talked about how can I sum this up maybe in just a few words. We got 30 more minutes. So, no, I'm just joking. So as children of God, right? Simple enough. As children of God, we need to be people of reconciliation. That is simple enough. We need to be people of reconciliation. To maybe give you a little bit more meat to that, we need to be people that live our lives in such a way that tells the world genuinely we believe in the gospel, the message of reconciliation, which was, right, the ultimate display of reconciliation. So we need to live out our lives, which would be the peace, the reconciliation, having those, there's obviously more to living out our lives, but we're talking about reconciliation today. So we would need to live out our lives in such a way that displays reconciliation, displays this peace, right? That shows the world we genuinely believe in the gospel, which is the ultimate display of reconciliation. So I ask, think to yourself, ask yourself, are there relationships that need to be reconciled? Things that you can do. Now obviously reconciliation can be a two-way thing, right? Because even with Jesus, we still need to accept that reconciliation. So just like in the regular world, we have to make every effort to make peace. Obviously, It's up to those people to choose that. But it doesn't mean that we don't still make every effort. So ask yourself, are there people in our lives that we need to continue to make those efforts to reconcile with? People that we can better display the gospel. Because if we're going to proclaim it, we need to live it. Right? So ask yourself, think about that over the next week or day or month, whatever. Just really think about that. Ask God if there's someone, because reconciling those relationships opens the door as well. You know, with the guy, this car mechanic, whatever, you know what I'm trying to say, tire shop, whatever. The guy there, right? If I didn't reconcile that relationship with him, I could close the door on my ability to be able to speak the gospel to his life. If he sees me constantly, if they see a Bible in my back seat and they're like, dude, this guy's a jerk. You know what I mean? Like, you know, they turn on the car and they hear the worship music and they're like, who is this dude? You know what I mean? Like, so just, you don't realize all the little things that can actually affect how people understand, especially in a world where we're already having so much stuff against Christians. We never understand how small things can be and how small they might seem to us, but they're not small to someone else. So we have to think, who can we reconcile relationships? And that might not be everyone here, but I will tell you, if it's not you now, it will be you someday. Because we all have relationships at some point in our lives, multiple times in our lives, that need to be reconciled. So I ask, let us be people of reconciliation. Let us be people that display the gospel that we proclaim. Let's pray. Father God, I just want to thank you so much for what you did for us on the cross. God, you are such an amazing God that, again, you've given us the opportunity to choose love, to choose you. And you did that. God, you reconciled us through the cross. You didn't force us. You didn't demand us. But God, you showed us how much you loved us with the cross. And yet, you just don't demand anything. It's amazing, God. You have your commands, you have your precepts, you have what you ask of us, but you don't demand. You give us the will to choose, and God, that's because you want us to choose you. You want us to love you well. So we just ask that as we realize what you've done for us on the cross, God, it compels us. It compels us to want to reflect you better, to reflect you more, to reconcile the relationships that are in our lives that we need to be reconciled. God, may the gospel be on the forefront of our minds, because it's why we're all here. Let that remain true in our hearts, God. Let the gospel just remain on the forefront of our minds, especially as we continue to mature in our faith, and we get so caught up sometimes with theological truths and the quote-unquote deeper parts of Christianity. But God, the gospel